The night was not a thing that came and went. In the Dark Ages, night was a kingdom of its own, vast and unchallenged. And in it lived the forgotten, the voiceless, and the powerless souls who moved like smoke through the alleys of manors, and villages who knelt behind cloistered doors, who stared up at wooden beams, waiting for a sign from a god who had grown silent. The fire had gone out in the blacksmith's hearth days ago. Ash lay thick on the anvil, dusted like a shroud, as if mourning its own purpose. The forge bellows hung slack, limp as a tongue bitten off in fear. A single horseshoe, unfinished, sat on the floor, its arc incomplete, its fate uncertain. Outside, the village clung to winter's edge. Hunger gnawed louder than wolves. In the low cottages, wrapped in straw and the smell of damp earth, children scratched at the frost on wooden walls and whispered of saints they had never seen. Candles were luxuries. Oil was for the Lord's lamps. The poor knew the dark well. They wore it like a second skin. In a stone keep high above the vale, a noble woman stood before a narrow window. Her hands trembled as she clutched her cloak tighter on her collarbone, where bruises bloomed like violets. Her husband's rage had left no scars on her face, he was clever that way, but her soul bent under the weight of every unspoken scream. She looked out across the moors, where the last of the sun had vanished hours ago, and she thought of her sister married off to a bishop in the south, no less a prisoner, gilded in piety. Women born into titles did not own their lives. They were traded like cattle, like secrets, like debts. A servant girl crept into the chamber carrying a bowl of broth, more water than meat. She said nothing, only bowed, eyes on the floor, hair tucked into a stained coif. Her silence was not submission, it was survival. No light, no mercy, not for those at the bottom, not even for those at the top. In the monastery 3 leagues away, a young novice copied scripture by candlelight, his fingers blistered from hours of ink and prayer. He had not spoken in 2 days, not as penance, but because he feared what would escape his mouth. Last week, a brother had confessed to dreaming of a woman's face. The abbot ordered his tongue scalded in wine and ash. The brother screamed only once. Now the others kept their dreams locked behind their teeth. In the scriptorium, silence reigned like a god of its own. The only sound was the scratching of quills, the occasional cough, the wind clawing at the stained glass windows. On the 3rd night of Lent, a child was left at the abbey gates, wrapped in linen, blue-lipped and breathless. No one opened the gate. In the morning, they found her frozen, one hand reaching toward the iron bars. A message pinned to her chest read, "Forgive me." But forgiveness, like warmth, was scarce in these days. Charity had rules, and the powerless could not afford mistakes. Further west, in a mining village where the hills opened their bellies to swallow men whole, a boy of 10 swung a hammer down into the rock face. His father had died 3 weeks prior, crushed beneath a cart. There was no burial, only a wooden cross nailed to the mine wall, carved with the word, "Remember." The boy had never learned to read, but he knew the shape of grief. He felt it in his arms, in his back, in the red lines that crawled across his palms. He swung the hammer not for bread, but for the right to stay in the one-room hut where his mother slept, thin and coughing through the night. If he could not work, the bailiff would evict them. The mine was dark, lit only by fat-dripping torches nailed to the walls. The smell was of sweat, mold, and blood. One man sang hymns under his breath to keep from falling into madness. Another had not spoken in years, only growled like an animal when touched. Their eyes gleamed in the dark like beasts in a cave, and still they toiled, not for glory, for survival, for crumbs. Power was not something the people understood as structure or politics. It was breath, bread, fire, a place to sleep without fear. A priestess' blessing or a baron's whim could be the difference between marriage or mutilation, between exile or execution. A young girl taken from her home for owing tax would never be seen again. A tenant farmer who spoke too loudly of hunger would find his fields salted by morning. There were no courts for them, only whispers, only the lash, only the mercy of those who had none. And yet, within the cracks, within the silences, within the very heart of this merciless age, something flickered. A widow in the far north, blind from birth, wove baskets from reed and nettle and gave them to orphans in the dead of winter. She sang as she worked, songs so old even the priests didn't know their meanings. She was accused of witchcraft once, but the villagers defended her, not with words, but with their bodies. They stood between her and the sheriff's men until the torches turned away. She returned to her hut and sang through the night. No one ever accused her again. Her voice became a kind of legend, a light no one could touch. In a burned-out chapel near the coast, a crippled knight lived alone. His armor rested in the corner, his sword long buried. He grew vegetables and wrote stories on the backs of old letters. Stories of women who ruled, of boys who ran fast enough to outrun the cold, of monks who fed wolves instead of fearing them. No one read them, no one even knew his name. But he lit a candle every night and placed the pages in a wooden box beside the altar, wrapped in linen. He said it was for those who would come after. He said no darkness lasted forever, though it might feel like it did. And so the Dark Ages pressed on not as a singular storm, but as a million quiet extinguishings, of voices, of names, of small flames crushed beneath boot heels. But here and there, someone still struck flint against stone, still blew breath into kindling, still whispered stories into the dust. In the cellars, in the fields, behind the veil, beneath the chainmail. There was no light, and there was no mercy. But there was memory. And sometimes that was enough.